What's up, YouTube? The topic for today is trigger control, kind of everything that goes with it. So, finger positioning, the techniques for pressing and resetting the trigger, kind of everywhere in between. In all candor, I think people get way too fixated on this or the wrong things, and it ends up being not really productive in a class setting. Like the idea, like, oh, you be super intimate with your trigger. You know every little in and out, and you have a special technique. That's the way you press it. I don't like that way of thinking for the specific reason of, well, in classes, sometimes I'll only have people for 2 days, or maybe I have them for a week. It could be 5 days, whatever. But people only have so much bandwidth to work with. So if you have 100% capacity, and sometimes when you put thoughts in people's minds, you can't get them to, like, whatever they see or think, you can't make them unsee or unthink them. So I'm careful about what things I intentionally do and don't mention during a class because I don't want people to get fixated or start thinking about the wrong things. For example, I rarely talk about kind of trigger control in this granular of a detail in classes because if I said you should never, how about this? You should never feel or hear your trigger reset because every time, like when the gun's, so you press the trigger while the gun's cycling, you should already have the trigger released. And when when the slide closes, you should already have the trigger reset to go. You should never ever have the gun go off and then you like reset it after it's already cycled and you get that little click. All of a sudden, like probably right now thinking, I wonder if I do that. The next time I go, I'm curious now. Well, then the next thing you know, with whatever drill I want people to work on or whatever aspect they'd be working on instead, people be like, some people in the back of their mind would be, I wonder if I make, mine does that click once in a while. I do that. It's only on partial targets. I feel like I do that, or I do that all the time. I didn't even realize. So instead, I think it's really important. You have to save people from themselves. You get kind of specific advice or information, and some stuff is intentionally left out. That's why I don't necessarily, not even necessarily, I never really word vomit on people. I try not to talk excessively, especially in a class setting. I try to be as clear and concise without babbling or talking in circles. Just what's the drill? What am I asking you to do? How am I assessing the drill? A few things that'll go wrong, a few things that you need to pay attention to, and then we get people shooting. Because if I talk too long, people space out, you lose their attention. And again, just kind of talking in circles, or if I try to impress somebody with how much I know about the subject or how much I could tell them, at some point, it kind of goes in one ear and out the other with people, and it's just too much. So I'm going to go into a little bit of more granular detail than I would normally in a class, just because, again, try to save people from themselves. And some of this stuff isn't necessarily productive, and some of the things I only bring up when, like, this specific shooter is doing this thing, then we'll have like a conversation, or if it's a few people, maybe it's a class conversation. But otherwise, on the line, sometimes people just get just the feedback they specifically need, but it doesn't get broadcast to the whole class just because it's not necessarily productive. First thing I want to talk about is finger positioning on the trigger. Everyone has different thoughts, processes. Again, I'm not married to a technique. Instead, I just want to give you kind of the outcome of what I want it to be, and then we're just going to kind of work along that process. So ultimately what happens, no joke, is you're going to need to press the trigger immediately back from the trigger, straight back towards the back of the pistol, and you want to shoot the gun straight. So if I push in the trigger sideways or from an angle, it'll be easy to steer into the gun. So for some people, if they're having a marksmanship issue, just like pressing the gun left or right, sometimes, depending on the person, the situation, and kind of watching their shooting, talking about finger position on the trigger is a beneficial thing for them. For most people, I think like the old school way of thought was to use the kind of the whirl of your fingerprint or the pad of your trigger finger to press back on the trigger. So it end up where you don't really have your fingers not really overhanging the trigger at all. You see a lot of, you need space in here between your finger and the frame. And my finger, I'm just using the pad to press the trigger straight back. The problem with that, sometimes depending on the weight of the trigger, especially with heavy triggers. It's easier to steer into the gun. Long fingers, short fingers, all that kind of stuff. People get to the point where they'll normally pull or hook the trigger, and it'll end up getting pulled towards their firing hand side because they're not pressing the trigger back. Instead, it's heavy and they're putting weight into it, and you'll see it steer kind of into the direction of their firing hand. The technique I like, or that works well for me, again, I'm trying to do principles more than techniques, but the what I use is just the index or the joint of between my so sorry, I'll use better words, like the first crease in my trigger finger. This is the easiest spot. This joint right here is where I like to press the trigger with. I feel like that gives me a bit more leverage. You'll see more of my finger is actually overhanging the trigger, and I feel like it allows me to press the trigger straight back in a way that I'm pressing from the trigger straight through to the back of the gun without doing the disturbing thing where I'd be pressing into the gun or steering it to one way or the other. But again, that's going to vary based on the person, and it's not something that I typically tell people to get. Well, people get too autistic also. It's like sometimes you have to protect people from themselves and not get into a rabbit hole about something. If it's not an issue, it just doesn't need to get brought up. But like I said, if you're steering the gun, something to consider is your finger on the finger position on the trigger. I also have a handful of different guns to kind of talk through. So a Walther PDP, this dude has the dynamic performance trigger in it, which weight-wise, it's not crazy light or anything. It's 3 pounds maybe or something, 3.5. Should put it on a scale, I guess. But with this one, it breaks a little bit differently than like the Glock I just showed you, because I just touched the pad, and there's very little movement before it breaks. With the Glock triggers in general, they kind of have more of a rolling break where the trigger travels more distance before it fires. Lastly, now the gun I started shooting with, DASA guns, way different. So you have a long trigger pull, the gun cycles, and you have a single action pull. For this style of gun especially, I feel like using that crease or that first joint on your trigger finger helps. This gun's got a pretty good trigger on it. It's maybe 6 pounds double action, 6 or 7. But some guns, if you're using a Beretta or a 226, 229, some of those have doubles in the 10, 12, 14 pounds. So having more leverage on the trigger helps with pressing the trigger straight back in a way that you're not moving or disturbing the gun. Because again, if I just use, even just now doing it, just using the whirl of my fingerprint, I could tell like the muzzle's kind of like oscillating a little bit more, and it just feels like I have more control to be able to press the trigger smoothly back, directly back without like influencing it or steering it one way or the other. So anyway, that's briefly trigger control. As far as pressing the trigger, people get, again, out in the weeds, autistic, and it's not beneficial. I don't focus so hard on the technique. I'll normally leave people to their own devices, and some people conceptualize it as prep and press or controlling and attacking or whatever. The process I like the best, again, this is just principle based, is I'm at some point, like big picture, regardless of what you're doing with it, whether it's carrying a gun for work or just shooting competition or just target shooting, at some point you'll have the pistol out. Your finger should not be touching the trigger because your sights aren't on target or you're not ready to fire. And then at some point, you're going to decide you are ready to shoot. Your finger is going to have to contact the trigger and you're going to have to fire the shot. So between there's a bunch of different techniques you could use. For me, I was like, just talking through it, it's like at some point, I'm not going to be touching the trigger. Then at the other point, I'm going to need to press the trigger. So I'm going to try to bridge the gap between those with the simplest thing to do. And that's just the approach I like. So there's a bunch of different ways you could press the trigger, and quickly going through, each trigger activates a little bit differently. And so you could find a way to justify whatever technique you like. The one I prefer is I'll just keep stacking pressure on the trigger until it breaks. That'll look different on different guns. So starting with the old Tanfolio, starting out, it's like 1 pound, 2 pound, 3 pound, 4 pounds, 5 pounds, 6 pounds is the way I conceptualize pressing the trigger with any of these. So what that means is I'm not touching the trigger and then I just roll on the pressure or keep stacking on the pressure was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The rate at which I stack on the pressure might change because if the target's very close, it would just be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If it's at 50 yards, maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But either way, I don't think of it as going like 0 pounds, 7 pounds, 0 pounds, 7 pounds. I don't like that approach. I think too many people like flip the switch in their head and all of a sudden like it's time to go now and you'll see them influencing it. So I like the idea of just stacking on pressure. That works pretty well with any type of gun, in my opinion. So this Glock, this has an Overwatch precision. They sent me a trigger to try what's in this one, but it's still a Glock trigger with some travel. So it's like not touching the trigger. I start touching the trigger, and then I'm just going to roll on the pressure, and at some point it's going to go off. I don't stop or stage it anywhere or if I feel a wall or anything like that, I'm just going to keep pressing the trigger. So it's one smooth motion regardless of what gun I'm using. Of these three, the Walther has maybe the best trigger. This one, it's just a little bit of this like take up, and then the trigger breaks. But all I do for there, surprise, surprise, I'm not touching the trigger, and then it's like 1, 2, 3, 4 pounds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And at the rate at which I stack that on might change depending on how close the target is, what the target difficulty is, any of those kind of things. But I don't want to, again, like decide like now's the time and go from 0 to 10, because going from 0 to 10 normally will influence the sights in some way. Next thing we talk about is resetting the trigger. People have a wide variety of thought processes on this also. I understand intellectually you should, like the best result would be the gun goes off, it resets, the trigger's only allowed to travel outwards enough so it clicks to reset, then pressing the trigger again. That would be this, like the fastest technique, I suppose, would be, so it stops there. I've got just a little bit more afterwards. So in theory, taking that out would help, but there's going to be a bunch of downsides with trying that technique. And if I lock in that technique on this Walther and get really good at, not necessarily click bang, but right in the reset, then when I go to shoot a different gun that's got a bit more reset on the trigger, that same technique isn't going to be the same because the Glock comes out a little bit further and it's got a little bit more after you let the trigger out. The stock 2, once the gun fires, it's a light pull. Then it's a very short reset there to the single action, and then afterwards, there's quite a bit more of this. So it's impossible to kind of come up with a technique that would work well for one gun. Instead, I like the idea of resetting the trigger just like farther than I need to reset the shot, but I don't want to get to the point of being so excessive that my fingers like flying in and out of the trigger guard and my thumb moves also, or anything like that. So in my training or dry fire practice, like for this gun, when I'm dry fire training, I press the trigger, it'll go dead, and after that, I'll be releasing my finger off the trigger, but training myself to bring my finger far enough away that it's going to reset and fire a shot if I'm shooting live ammo. So again, with the Walther, the same deal. And with this, like if I'm practicing, my finger will still come like slightly out of contact with the trigger. Just because there's so little reset, I don't want to try to ride that at all. It's just too tough. And then if I want to shoot for business reasons, for work, I might need to shoot a different gun. Or maybe I shoot a student's gun to diagnose an issue, or people want me to shoot their gun or whatever. I don't want to have a technique that's only going to work for this. Like, I just need if only I had my M&P with the Apex trigger and this number 2 pound spring, I could do this technique. But now that I've got a factory Glock 17 with no trigger parts, it doesn't work, kind of a thing. Pick on the M&P because those do have pretty light triggers with the Apex stuff. The guys that like those, like, oh man, this thing's so light. I'm like, yep, it is. But again, I like a technique that works well for any gun. Let's see, what else? So we talked about resetting the trigger. And then kind of the last piece here I want to talk about is sometimes when people go to fire the shot, you'll see their finger do weird things. So for example, my finger's like this. I make the decision I want to fire, it's not uncommon to see somebody pull their finger away to then press the trigger. I think it's some amount of like aiming before you're pressing the trigger and that thought process of going from 0 pounds to 5 pounds or whatever weight you need. So if I'm shooting a fast pair, sights are on target, it looks, I'm transitioning between whatever, but the sight gets to where I want to go. I want to just press the trigger from where my finger's at immediately with using that pressure technique I showed you, or I was talking about, where I roll on the pressure. If it's a close target, it's going to happen very, very quickly. If it's a target farther away, smaller, partial, then I'll roll on the pressure more gradually, more carefully. If it's the same thing, again, I'm not stopping along the way to check the sights and then press more. Instead, it's just one smooth press. I think that's really important because that technique does contribute to low left stuff, which I'll talk about more in a second. But if you're watching or you're shooting on video, or if somebody's paying attention to you, or just your own awareness, I don't want to have where it's like you decide it's time to press the trigger and then your finger goes out and then in, or it'll be like, sometimes people like kind of double press, or they'll hitch before they do it. I don't like any of those things. Normally that comes from tension or people having the mindset of going from 0 pounds to 5 or 6 pounds, depending on how heavy the trigger is. So I like the idea of just, I'll press the trigger harder than I have to in dry fire training, enough that if I'm firing live ammo, it's going to go off, and I don't want to have, my finger should just go immediately towards the trigger when it's time to press it, instead of going away to then go to the trigger. Be like, if I had to do something like that, it'd just be too confusing and not beneficial. Last thing, I want to talk quickly about low left. It's a question that comes up a lot in the comments. So like I said earlier, you can only think about, or at the beginning you can only think about one thing at a time, or your brain only has so much bandwidth. So in training, it'd be fine to work on thinking about the way you press the trigger, conceptualize it while you're doing marksmanship or your dry fire training, making sure that you're assessing the path your finger's taking to the trigger. But if you think about it while you're shooting in the way of like the prep and press style, where I'm going to like pull part of the way, then I do some aiming, and then I decide to fire the rest of the shot, it's likely going to influence where the bullets go. Some people are good with prep and press. Some people say they prep and press, but if you watch like on video, they're not really. If you watch my shooting on video, sometimes it would look like prep and press, because it'd be like my finger's not touching the trigger. Then all of a sudden, when I like decide to press the trigger, you see my finger go to it, but then you can't, like, you're not able to see the pressures that I'm applying to the trigger. So instead, it would just look like that. You're like, oh, you pause long. It's like, no, I'm just keep applying pressure, but it's not that I'm stopping or starting or doing any kind of a pause. All I'm doing is just rolling on the pressure. And again, the speed at which I would apply the pressure changes based on the difficulty of the target, or how carefully I apply the pressure. Also with the low left, you can kind of only think about one thing. So in my opinion, if I fixate my brain hard on like, okay, press the trigger, get to the wall, do that, or you think about like roll on the pressure, that can help. But I also like the idea of just focusing on your hand overall while you're firing the shot. And the thought process would be just don't push into the gun. Not so much think about pressing the trigger in this way, but instead thinking about my whole hand and kind of letting my support hand do its thing and working on just pressing into the trigger without trying to influence the gun or fight the recoil that I know is coming. Or sometimes people will see the sight lift and they'll want to push down to stop that lift from coming. So a variety of different methods to kind of get to the same place. But in my opinion, it's important where you place your focus, because if you get into little, sometimes you can get lost too much in the details, that if you're really fixated and thinking about just that, it makes it tough to pull back and look at the big picture. And again, I don't want to have really a technique, or I don't want to be putting my brain on like making sure I just barely reset the trigger. I'd want that just to be a habit. Or I don't want to think about getting to the wall, like find the wall on the trigger. I don't want to think about that, because that's not where I want my attention to be. My attention should be on finding the spot on the target I want to shoot, maybe not clamping down the gun with my firing hand, maybe not pushing down to influence the gun, but not really focusing or spending my brain power on like looking for the trigger or trying to find this spot on the trigger. I need to pause from pressing the shot. So anyway, a few different techniques, kind of in just thought process for things I like and don't like. I like to talk about principles more than techniques just because everybody's hands are a little bit different types of triggers, guns, double action, single action. So you're looking to find something that works for you, but hopefully some just kind of general concepts to help you in shooting the gun straight. Marksmanship is quite important. So hopefully that's helpful. Gives you some things to think about to take to your training. If you have any questions, drop it below. I suspect there will be a few questions for this one, and if needed, I'll either answer the question in the comments if I can easily, or I'll just make a follow-up video to answer your questions. Either way, I appreciate you watching.